All right. People are
Hello,
still filtering
hello.
in, but hi, Justine, do you want to kick us
Okay,
off?
yeah, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We have lots to cover, so we're just going to jump right in. We are partners in public innovation, and presenting today are our co-founders, which is myself, Justine Hinderleiter, and my partner, Ryan Hunter. We're so happy to have you with us here today. As you enter, please go ahead and drop a note in the chat with your name and where you're from. We'd love to, be able to know all of you. And just a note that we are recording this webinar. So next slide, please. All right. Across the country, governments are under pressure to deliver more. We seem to be kind of operating in this place of scarcity. And we have a huge housing gap. We're feeling the pressures of not having skilled healthcare professionals, and even predictions that it's only really going to get worse. And we're falling short in things like security, especially in our increasingly digitized world. Um, Today, we're going to explore how to move away from this scarcity paradigm. Next slide, please. At PPI, we think that we should and can be operating differently, really more in this abundance mindset rather than the scarcity one that we have been operating in. And when we're talking about abundance in government, what that looks like is actually government doing more, kind of expanding services and access and equity. The abundance agenda is truly in the zeitgeist now. You can see there are lots of prominent organizations and strategists who believe in this too, that government can and should be doing more. Next slide. But the challenge is that we can't just like wave a magic wand and deliver more. We have to first understand what is blocking us from an abundant today. A lot of what we see at PPI and we've experienced in our own public sector careers, it's that we have this really an epidemic of process problems throughout all levels of government, local, state, federal, and across fields. It's field agnostic. We have things like outdated systems. So, for example, we have calcified permitting, we have broken procurement, we have impossible hiring. And all of these issues are blocking progress really at every turn. And without tackling these quintessential government process problems, the promise of abundance just gets stalled out. And it's actually really these challenges in our implementation that prevents government's ability to deliver. So even if we make headway, say, like policy reform in the hopes of better and more delivery, those policy changes can't translate into change on the ground if something like hiring takes 9 months or procurement takes over a year. Next slide, please. The old adage of government just needs more resources, like, we need more budget or staff or whatever it may be. It doesn't really hold because just pumping in investment isn't going to translate into change either. You really have to be poised to receive those inputs, and right now we're not. Right now, it's like we have this knot that's been forming for years, maybe even decades in some circumstances. And you can't just like yank on that knot and hope that it's going to untangle and expect it to perform better. You actually have to prime the complex government processes and systems, or our knot, to take on those resources first.
Oh, all right. I think this is me now, Justine, right? Um, so we asked you all when you registered today, kind of the questions that you have and the issues that you were facing, kind of about being abundant in the work that you do. And this is what we heard. I mean, a set of things that we hear really commonly from the local agencies that we work for. So we heard people say, how is it that we maintain the levels of service that we provide when it's hard for us to hire new staff and to retain the ones that we have? We heard about cultural issues that are like, how do we have a culture that's valuing improvement and efficiency in government? Justine referenced antiquated systems, antiquated software. Sometimes I hear people talk about these as the sort of kludge or the policy cruft or the red tape of government process that builds up over time. And then folks had questions about silos, right? Both like, how do we just work together with departments inside of our own agency, or our own city, our own county? Um, and then how do we work across jurisdictions? Like, that's hard. People don't have venues to do that. I want to say thank you for sharing all of these challenges with us. This is what that knot looks like. And I think we've all seen ways that people try to make progress against these things and wind up just pulling that knot tighter. The question I want us to wrestle with today is, how do we actually do the careful work of untangling that knot? Let's go forward. Well, I want to give you a couple of things today that that we have done together with cities and counties and special districts and states to specifically untangle those knots. So first, by convening staff who work on these process problems in bottleneck breaking pilots that look directly at what those challenges are that stop progress, and have those folks work together to build a better way. And then secondly, to build up the capacity of the career civil servants who are in the midst of those processes every day to creatively solve exactly those kind of problems. So let's move to the next slide. First, I want to tell you a few stories of how some agencies have tackled these kinds of capacity constraining bottlenecks in government. There's three areas that we hear about consistently that are critical blockers to progress and frustrations for nearly every government agency. So let's look at a few of those in turn. So the first one is procurement. Uh, Anything that our governments don't do themselves, they have to buy. And that everything that they buy needs a contract. And that includes just about everything that we build, just about all of our computer systems, most of the direct services that we're providing to our communities. And if you want to deliver those things better and faster, you have to start with procurement. So let's look at one county, how one county tackled contracting bottlenecks to deploying human services. I'm going to tell you a story about some work that we did in Pierce County. Let's look at the next slide. So Pierce County a few years ago was facing some kind of critical issues in how they were contracting for human services. So after COVID, the county had actually received a lot more money for human services from ARPA funds. It actually doubled both the dollar amount and the number of contracts that they had to provide human services into the community. It was over 175 million more dollars in funding. But at the same time, the contracting process that they had to deploy those funds, it was lengthy, it was complicated, and it was fragile. So that when all of that new money came and put weight on that contracting process, it broke. That looked like errors in kind of administering RFPs and solicitations, sometimes requiring them to redo an entire RFP process. Those kinds of errors led to increased scrutiny, and that increased scrutiny meant more reviews, more approvals, which was more delays. Let's look at the next slide. So, in fact, when we worked with the team there to map what their contracting process looked like, we found that a typical funding process took almost a year, some of them more than a year. And when that happened, there were some pretty pretty visceral impacts on their human services. Uh, we heard stories about community providers who were going without pay because their old contract had expired, but the county wasn't able to put in place a new contract yet. That meant that critical human services were threatened. So we had nonprofit providers kind of having to make decisions like, well, do we close down the county's emergency homeless shelter, or do we figure out how to spin it along without any county funds for a few months, trusting that the county is going to put our contract in place? And actually, they risked losing state and federal funds because they were going to expire before they could issue the money. Not, I will say, because of the staff who were in that process, who were making really heroic efforts to move that process forward, but because of this long and complicated process that had so many layers of review and approval. So they convened a team that included all the different relevant county departments and also representatives from community providers, and they worked on designing a better way. So the big thing that they worked on was to move that process from being push based, by which I mean only moving forward to the next step after the thorough review and someone has signed off, to being pull based. So it's a different kind of a question. The sort of pull based question is, what do we have to do to approve this contract at next month's board meeting? What would it take to ensure that it's approved in August? That we built that in a lot of different places, but for example, one thing that the team found was that it took nearly 2 months to negotiate a contract after it had been fully approved. So this means they didn't start talking directly to the provider about what the contract should look like until after it had been approved at a public meeting. Um, but we asked, with the team, what would it take in order to sign that contract on the day after it's been approved? Because after all, these are being approved in a public meeting. The funding recommendations were a part of the public record months before. Very rarely were they changing. So the answer is some version of, well, you have to have a draft contract in place on the day that it's approved, which means that you have to start writing and negotiating that contract with a vendor who you don't have legal authority to purchase from yet. Um, all of that's totally reasonable, totally legal, but it's not the way we've always done it. It requires thinking about that work a little bit differently. Let's go to the next slide. But the results, if you can break out of the way that we've always done it, are that you can make that change and a few more like it. And that team charted out a path forward to contract in nearly half the time. So to cut 6 months off of a contracting process. That's the kind of thing that's possible when you sort of pick up and look at the knot and work on untying the knot. So let's move on to the next story. Another thing that we hear frequently from the agencies that we work with is about permitting. Permitting is a root cause issue for so many of the things that we in public agencies want to build and do. When we build roads and bridges, when we build housing, when we do community development work, power plants in our energy future, the businesses that you license and allow in your city, all of those things require permits. And you can ask anybody who's trying to open a restaurant what the worst part of opening that restaurant is. It's waiting for their permits. And sometimes we manage to do this so slowly that we can bankrupt a business before it's even opened because they've been paying rent on a space that they can't get a permit to open for months and months. So let's look at another story. This one from the city of Boise, dealing with childcare licensing. Let's look at the next slide. A few years ago, Boise was in a pretty serious childcare shortage, so many cities are. So at the time, they had 5,000 childcare slots to provide for about 14,000 young kids with working parents who needed childcare. So at the same time, though, they made it quite difficult to become a childcare provider. The typical application process was more than 3 months. And in fact, even that number sort of disguises how long it could be, because appeals could more than double that. Um, they had to deal with about 5 different city and other agency departments, um, pay fees at 5 or 6 places along the way. These are, by the way, a lot of these in-home childcare providers were recent immigrants, a lot of them non-English speakers. So not easy for them to navigate the sort of complicated bureaucratic process. And in fact, the city was issuing renewals so slowly that a lot of these small providers missed the opportunity to get a certain kind of state funding just because the timing made it basically impossible for them to do that. So let's look at a little bit of what this team did. Um, so they unpacked this process in a similar way. Um, and they also sort of asked the question, what would it take to do this in a faster way, in a way that's friendlier to our businesses, to getting childcare capacity in our community? So one thing they looked at was neighbor notification. So when they started this work, all of these childcare facilities, before they could open, were required to notify all of their neighbors within a few hundred feet of the facility. Not just notify them, but then provide proof back to the city that they had notified them. And sometimes these childcare facilities were in an apartment building, so that could be dozens or even hundreds of neighbors who were within proximity of where you're planning to do an in-home childcare. Um, any one of those neighbors could force an appeal and a hearing about whether it's appropriate to put the childcare facility there. We learned from the team that those appeals were basically never upheld, like on the merits. These neighbors never prevailed in convincing the city that this childcare facility was not appropriate for the space. But what the neighbors could sometimes do was delay and drag out the process long enough to drive that would-be childcare provider out of business. In the best case, these appeals added 3 months to the process of licensing a childcare provider. One of the things that the team did out of this work, they were in the middle of a zoning code revision, and they decided to eliminate the neighbor notification rules for all but the largest childcare centers. Um, that eliminated the possibility of these appeals. It reduced costs for childcare providers, and it really simplified the process, even for their city staff, who didn't have to deal with um, as many confused, frustrated childcare providers jumping through additional hoops. Let's go to the next slide. Another thing that a lot of you had raised wanting to know about was silos. And in fact, this process, like so many of them, involved a whole litany of city departments and even external agencies. I think there were 5 different teams that you had to get approval from, whether it was planning or code enforcement, or there was an external health agency. Um, and a lot of these people didn't have any place where they regularly interact, right? They're looking at their piece of the process, but no one is looking at the end-to-end experience of the applicant. And that's how you wind up with an applicant having to pay 5 different fees over the course of a process, where we told them it was going to cost them $150 at the beginning, and at the end they've paid nearly 1,000. That's a hard thing to ask of the sort of like low income folks that are often the ones who are opening these childcare facilities. So one example of what it looks like when you actually provide a space for all these people to talk together, you give them a place to sort of break these silos down. So for example, in this process, the team found that they were actually conducting 2 different inspections of each facility. Their code enforcement team conducted one, and an external health department conducted one. When they looked at what these inspections entailed, they found that they were about 80% the same. But again, they don't speak to each other. But during this work, they were around a table, and the code enforcement team sat with the health agency team, and they made a plan to consolidate these inspections into one inspection, which is great. And one thing I want to highlight here, though, is that I think from the outside, a change like this can look really simple. I just want to point out, like, this change was not simple, right? This required the Boise city attorney to have to agree to delegate the city's legal inspection authority to an outside agency, required and the health department being willing to take on additional questions that aren't their questions for the sake of satisfying what the city needs to know. Um, that requires work that's not maybe any one person's job today. But again, when you could put people around a table and get them to sort of unpack these issues and design solutions together, you can get some incredible results. So for Boise, that meant that they were able to renew, like build a process that was renewing new in-home childcare licenses in for the sort of medium-sized facilities that were the most frequent ones in about a quarter of the time, in less than a month instead of more than 3 months. And that's what they were able to achieve through thoughtful process design. All right, I think I'm turning this over to Justine for talking about hiring.
Yes, hiring, near and dear to my heart. Um, so hiring in a civil service context, but really in any sort of organization, um, but literally every service government provides requires that you fill your positions with qualified people to perform those related duties, right? Whether it's public safety or you're maintaining your parks or you have a public hospital, whatever it is, you have to staff those things. And we see nearly across the board that local governments and state governments, um, they're all suffering under these old, antiquated, needlessly complicated, and really slow hiring processes. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about another project story, one that we recently did with the city of San Diego. And we worked with them to slash their hiring timeline in half. Next slide. You know, similar to the projects that Ryan highlighted, we worked with a cross-functional improvement team. And so when we started this project, the city of San Diego was experiencing a 12% vacancy rate, and it took over 14 months to fill a position. So if you know, I'm sure many of you guys can relate to this. If you can't hire appropriately, then you're going with these, you know, very, very lean teams, and all these problems start to compound into everything that you do. So some of those downstream effects that the city of San Diego was experiencing, it was showing up as like overtime budgets in the police department were blown out for the past 10 out of 11 years. Um, there were all these crazy backlogs for maintaining their parks and their recreation facilities. Um, it was just in every department, they were feeling it. All right. Next slide, please. So again, we convened a cross-departmental improvement team. We had a lot of folks from their personnel department, which is the department in charge of most of the civil service hiring process. And then we also had folks in the operating department. So we had hiring managers join on this team because it was really important to understand their perspective and what they were struggling with in this process. So collectively, these are all the people who are responsible for some aspect of hiring activities, right? And we brought them together and mapped out their hiring process. They had never done that before. And we really wanted to uncover those pain points that the city was experiencing. So an example of a pain point that we uncovered was that it was taking nearly 4 months to actually initiate a hire. So let's say someone leaves, And it's taking it's taking the city 109 days to actually start the process to fill that vacancy. And that was just insane to people, like when we uncovered that data point, right? And we needed to understand why. Like, why is that happening? Next slide, please. So through root cause analysis, which is, something that we love and do a lot here at PPI, um, we wanted to understand why that 109 days was happening, right? How could we make it easier ultimately to initiate a hire and cut that time down? And so what we uncovered is that um, they have these people who are called appointing authorities. And I'm sure lots of folks here understand what that term means, but I'll explain it. It's the people who have the power to say, go ahead and fill that position, right? Usually these folks are often like high up in the organization, right? And so, in order to get that go ahead, first, that appointing authority has to be made aware of the vacancy, right? And those vacancies are likely 3, 4, 5 layers deep in their organization. So it's not necessarily something that the appointing authority has like immediate knowledge of, right? So that notification could take time. And then once that appointing authority says, yes, go ahead, then there was a payroll person that had to fill out a form to initiate that process for them. But that payroll person was often, as they should be, consumed with their biweekly payroll process, right? They're not necessarily top of mind paying attention to all these one-off hiring tasks that kind of float to them here and there. But so that form that the payroll person then completes has to be routed back to the appointing authority, right? And they then have to find it in their queue and click approve. And you factor in schedules and vacations and leaves and like the 5 million other things on everybody else's plate, right? It's no wonder that it's taking 109 days. So, one of the solutions that the team came up with was, what if we held bi-weekly hiring meetings, right? And it's with those appointing authorities. And at that meeting, we go over all the new vacancies with them and we get their verbal approval as opposed to, clicking a form approve button or whatever. We get their verbal approval and we just fill out the form. We fill it out right there, right? That allowed the personnel staff, who is mainly responsible for effectuating all these hiring tasks, they were then able to initiate the hires for the operating departments. And so at most, we're talking about a 2-week time frame to initiate rather than the almost 4 months that they had been experiencing. Next slide, please. So not only did like these results produce hiring process for half the time that they had originally had, which is phenomenal in and of itself, but it had all these other benefits, right? Really it built their staff capacity to problem solve was the main thing that really is what we're so jazzed about to do all these projects. We get to see it come to life. It also improved the candidate experience and it improved the relationships between the hiring staff in the personnel department and the hiring managers in those operating departments. And overall, all of that is going to improve morale, which is just going to make everything feel easier and better, right? Next slide, please. And that overall improvement in experience and relationships and morale, that's really what we're talking about is culture change, right? And one of the things that we did to cultivate that culture change, and we do this with most of our projects, is we created something called a huddle. A huddle is a consistent and brief team meeting where team members connect around a specific strategic goal. So in this case was City of San Diego, it was improving their hiring process, right? And the huddle is a place where they can support each other in achieving that goal, right? And everyone is encouraged to offer ideas of what to change, big and small. And we had one team member at an early huddle on this project. They posed an idea to improve their conviction history form, which is, a sub process, if you will, within the hiring process. And it was something that was consistently being filled out incorrectly by candidates. And it sucked up so much of their time, so much of the staff's time to educate and fix and guide the candidates in actually completing that form correctly. So one of the team members offered this really simple form design change to make it easier for the candidates to fill that form out correctly the first time that they're filling it out, right? That single innovation ended up saving the city 1/3 of an FTE based on saved time, right? The huddle was key, though, to unlocking that idea, to kind of giving that safe space and encouragement for folks at any level in that hiring process to come up with an idea and drive that improvement. And ultimately, we're talking about cultivating that culture of continuous improvement. Next slide, please. So all of these projects that Ryan and I just talked about, these improvements that were achieved, like they were achieved without adding new budget or staff. It's like we're not pumping in these new investments, right? They came before, they preceded and supported new IT implementation, and that's really critical, that it happens beforehand, because you don't want to hard code all your inefficiencies in a fancy new piece of tech and just basically end up having shiny buttons but an old process underneath. Um, and it was accomplished without these higher level legislative or policy reforms, right? It was happening more at the implementation level, at the practice level, at the procedure level. And that's how all of these gains were made, right? And a lot of the solutions that teams were coming up with, like the form change that I just gave you, it's not like rocket science, right? They weren't actually hard to implement. And so that's a question for you right now. Um, and I'd love for you to enter into the chat and respond to this. Like, if that's the case, that these solutions weren't hard to do, why isn't this happening regularly, like already? Why aren't we already doing this? Get in that chat and you tell me what you think. Why are these solutions not happening already? No one has any time. Yes. Ah, yes. That's the way it's always been done. That's our most love to hate reason, right? It's not a part of people's official job descriptions. Nice. A lack of support or imagination. All of it. Liz says boomers. um, no one is responsible. Yep. Yes, these are all really on point responses. And they all kind of come down to like change and innovation. And we can go to the next slide. Change and innovation isn't a one and done approach, right? In order to unlock this kind of change, this kind of innovation, and actually sustain it, you must increase and develop your staff's capacity to problem solve, right? You have to build an army of Leslie Nopes out there across your services. And what do you really need to do to build that kind of capacity? Let's go to the next slide.
Hey, Justine,
Yeah.
can
And
I
I'm going
throw
to,
in one thing on the army of Leslie Nopes? I just want to, I just really want to highlight um, how important it is that this is not work that you just like helicopter in and like fix a thing and helicopter back out again. And how important it is that this actually has to be about building the capacity of the people who are in the work every day to do this work in an ongoing way. So here's my true confessions. I learned as we were putting this webinar together that the project that we talked about in Boise, the state of Idaho is now taking back from them their childcare licensing. Now the state's going to do the licensing instead of the city. If the only outcome of that project were a faster childcare licensing process, and that's it, then all of that work has just been undone. But that's why you've got to actually build the capacity of the people who are doing that work to be able to tackle the silos and think about this work differently because stuff changes. Of course, stuff will change. Of course, your policies and processes should look different in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. But you have to be ready to apply this same kind of thinking and approach to whatever the next challenge is. And that's not done by some consultant, it's done by an army of Leslie Notes.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. So go to the next slide, please. So what do you need to build that kind of capacity that we're talking about, right? You need to give your staff the right tools and help them to develop the right skills. You need to give them leadership support and clear the way for them, right? You need to support their own and your organization's change management competency, right? This this isn't something that's one and done. It's absolutely a cultural shift wherein you are then enabling and empowering your staff to be those internal change makers. Next slide, please. And an example of doing that is our leadership development program called Lean Leaders, and it does all of these things. It's a leadership development program that's specifically tailored to the government context. And over the years, we've trained hundreds of government leaders at varying levels of the organization. So when I say leader, I mean that very broadly, right? More of a mindset than an actual title. So we've trained them with practical process improvement skills and tools, talked and re-talked and applied all these new concepts like change management, right? How are we priming people to take on and adopt a change to a process? That's all what change management is about. We're also teaching project management tools. How are you actually managing this project of change? What are the technical components to it? And through this program, we're giving them customized one-on-one coaching throughout. And afterwards, they're emerging with the skills and the gumption, frankly, to drive organizational change from within. It's a highly practical program because participants apply the new skills and tools that they're learning to a real process problem that is something that their organization wants them to fix, right? So they come in with a real world project, something to fix, something to improve, and they're applying these new skills and tools to a real thing that has real consequences. And they're emerging from the program with a project plan and pilot solutions already in place. Let's go to the next slide and we'll look at a couple of examples of past lean leaders. So we have Amy here from SFUSD, and she came in with a project of wanting to improve the delivery time of PPE from 6 weeks. During the pandemic, when PPE was super critical to get out there, not that it's not ever, but it was very heightened at that time, of course. It was taking them 6 weeks to deliver it to their various different school sites, right? But through Lean Leaders, they were able to cut that down to 2 days. We have a blog on both of these examples and lots of other examples of past lean leaders. So I encourage you to check those out. We have another one from Matt from SFPUC, and he was working on a fix-it request process. He worked in kind of the maintenance division of the water quality division of PUC, and they were getting requests for various different maintenance issues and facility issues in water quality that was taking them like a month and a half to resolve. And he trimmed that down through this program to 12 days, right? These are just a couple of examples. We've got tons of others on our blog, so please go check those out. Next slide, yeah. So you can't just expect your hardworking and very capable staff to know how to fix these things, right? It's impossible to focus on strategy when you are so busy bailing out the water that is constantly drowning you. It's really hard to take a step back. And in some cases, you don't even feel like you have permission to do that. You don't have the space to do that. It's really hard to step back and like think about figuring out how to patch that hole that is drawing the water in because you're so busy carrying out the daily operations of bailing, right? And that's what really is required to build the capacity is giving that space, giving that support, and empowering your staff to become those dynamic problem solvers. Ryan, I'm going to turn the rest over to you.
Thanks, Justine. Let me get my spotlight back on. Yeah. Um, so then how do you actually prepare for this kind of abundant future? How do you do the work of getting, building the capacity to break these kinds of bottlenecks? So, I mean, first, I think you have to figure out how to do the work of untying the knots. That's some investment in process improvement. Um, I like to think like, well, you've got to take a minute to stop bailing and start figuring out how you patch the holes in your ship. That's scary. It means that for a minute the water level goes up, um, but it's the work that you have to do if you want to get away from a reactive, constantly under the gun world into one in which you're continuously improving. Um, and it takes an investment of like some I have a thought in a second about investment of some amount of funds, although we're trying to figure out ways that we could work with funders in order to remove some of the financial barrier, um, but also an investment of just people's time and energy to do that work. And then you need leaders. I think so many of you put in the chat about leadership, and I think that's exactly right. So often our sort of way like the what we hold up and reward in leadership is like staying out of trouble. And I think we need a vision of how do we have leaders who are able to problem solve and take some risks and do some things a little bit differently. And then we need the people, the Leslie Nopes, the army of Leslie Nopes, who can see these things and have both the tools and the sort of practical tools and also the sort of um, change management gumption to be able to make the change. I want to tell you one thing that we are working on right now that we're excited about to kind of prep for, to be one answer to that abundant future. Can we go to the next slide? We have been trying to talk about, what would it look like to really do this in a smart, strategic way? What if we were able to get a funder who would be helpful in being like letting us convene a group of cities working on a shared problem at the same time? So we've been talking about how we could stand up a cohort of abundant cities. So that would mean selecting a handful of jurisdictions who are working together at the same time on some shared challenge through some sort of application process, um, like a bottleneck that's blocking them from really building out capacity. So um, let's say that means working together on issuing multifamily housing permits, then running the kinds of pilot work that we already talked about in each one of those jurisdictions kind of in parallel. And as you've seen, we're able fairly consistently to get improvement in those places at least sort of like cutting times in half. But even more than that, how do we build the Leslie Nopes in each one of those cities, and then really get some benefit from people working together on the same thing at the same time? So can we do some of that training that's just focused on, in this example, people who are doing community development work or housing permitting work, and let them learn from each other, convening that community of practice, and then learning some from that, both, what's sort of unique to this or that city? What are the things that we all share? What can we learn from each other? And then can we actually develop like, here's the model um, housing permit process for a California city, and then be able to also identify like what are the things that are actually out of our control? Is there a slate of things that this group of jurisdictions could work together to advocate for at, let's say, like the state legislative level, for example? So this is something that we are kicking around right now. If that's something that's of interest, can we go to the next slide? Um, we are kind of looking right now both for local governments who would be interested in joining that kind of cohort, um, doing that kind of a bottleneck pilot. And we're also beginning to talk to funders who are interested in sponsoring a cohort. So if that's either, if you are one of those people, if you're connected to one of those people, we'd love to hear from you. All right. I think in a second, with whatever time we have left, I think we should open things up to questions. Um, but we'll send you a link as a follow-up that where you can both we'll send a brief survey that's sharing a little bit about ways if you were interested in getting more plugged in. You're also always welcome to book a call with me or Justine. We would love to chat with you about what's going on in your jurisdiction and how we could encourage you guys. Justine, am I forgetting anything?
I don't think so. I
If
would
folks
love
have
to
a,
hear from
go ahead.
folks if they have any questions, though.
Yeah, maybe I'll even change the setting that lets you unmute yourself.
Oh, yes, we do need to unlock that. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, why don't you? Actually, we have a lot of people. I think if everybody just unmutes, it'll be a little chaos. But if you've got a question, drop it in the chat, and then we'll. Oh, Laura, do I have thoughts
Yes.
about SF's hiring process?
So many thoughts. Yes. Um, the answer is yes, if convening the right team.
Well, and Laura probably knows this, but part of the story of how PPI came to be was that I was working for the city of San Francisco. Justine was managing, was the chief people officer in a city department, and we cut 2 months off of Justine's hiring process. So, yes, I have lots of thoughts about hiring
Yeah.
in San Francisco.
Oh, Johanna or Joanna, sorry, I'm not sure. Says non-management staff here. How do you obtain buy-in from management on process improvements you see are badly needed? Yes. Um, well, this is part of that change management landscape, right? Which I think a lot of people really downplay or underestimate its importance, really. When you're looking at process improvement projects or, really kind of any change related project, the project management side and the change management, which is the people side of that change, really need to work together. Um, and most often I see projects tanking, not because of the project details or technical details, but because of the change management shortcomings, right? And so change management is not a one and done thing either. This is an iterative, continuous thing that you're working at. And so, Johanna, I would encourage you to identify, like, start sleuthing out where there are some folks at the management level who are into the change, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to start with the process owner over that large scale process, right? In fact, if you're not even sure of their stance on changing it, it's probably better for you to start a little lower level and see if you can garner some support at the supervisor level, at the division manager level, whatever it may be. But it's really about getting some folks on board about what those changes can and should be, and then working together to change the hearts and minds, so to speak, of the higher level people. Ryan, do you want to chime in?
Well, I think I would just add, and this is something we teach explicitly when we do lean leaders with
Right.
folks. Um, I I think we're always working with folks to understand like how do you sort of speak to people in their gut or their like
Yeah.
emotions about some of this. So I'm thinking of like an example from the San Diego hiring work. Their data in their applicant tracking system was kind of a disaster.
Yes.
And their data being such a disaster was like a root cause of so many of their problems. But if you start talking to people about like, well, our data governance practices are not real good, then their eyes glaze over and they stop paying attention to you halfway through the conversation. Um, but if you show them like, look, here's our most recent hire, and do you see this giant wall of text over here? These are the like free text fields that our staff are spending an hour working through where they're just like free text entering every position number that's
For
attached to this
years.
like right um like that's how we manage the hire. And then because the folks who are like leaders, they're not in that every day, they don't see it, they have to see it and they have to go, oh, that's not good.
Mhm.
Like it has to be real, right? It has to understand, why does
Yeah.
this thing matter, right?
Yeah. And if I can kind of dovetail off of that, and if there's other questions, by all means, folks, populate it in the chat and we can move on, but I'm not seeing other ones right now. Um, an example from our own process improvement project for the hiring improvement project that we did at the PUC when I was there. Um, when we mapped out our process, the entire hiring process, which similar to the city of San Diego, that was not something that we had done ever before. No one actually understood what the whole dang process looked like what are all the steps? Because everybody there was operating in their own little lane, their own little silo, their own little piece of the process. But when we mapped that out physically on butcher paper with sticky notes, it was so long that it wrapped around the 13th floor Hetch Hetchy conference room, the executive conference room in the PUC. And when I was making my, pitch essentially to get, some of these improvements across the line, I took that process map and I put it up on the walls so that I could demonstrate to my colleagues how complicated and crazy and long this process was so that they could take away that tangible piece and understand really what we were dealing with and not think that, like HR was just complaining or whatever, right? They could see for themselves how horrible it was. So that kind of like finding how to make them care in a real way is really crucial for change management stuff. But we do teach all this stuff in Lean Leaders, and we would encourage you to come join us.
Okay. Justine, Laura is asking about labor unions,
Oh, yeah.
which I'm going to mostly let you respond because you are the labor negotiation queen over there. But
Yeah.
I will just say this, that I have been in lots of projects in which people were quite nervous about
Right.
labor unions, and I have been in exactly zero projects in which the labor union actually became a major obstacle to change. My experience is that they're mostly an obstacle. They're a theoretical people don't want to touch something because they're afraid in advance of what the labor union is going to say,
Right.
but without actually engaging with them. But Justine,
Yeah. Yeah. I
I'm
mean,
thinking about San Diego again.
yeah, that's absolutely my experience too. Labor unions are one stakeholder in whatever your project is. And I think the key there is to really employ similar change management, start talking with them early and often. They need to understand what the project is. And frankly, they want these systems to work better too, especially like hiring. Better hiring process means they get more members, right? They like that. Then they have less complaints from their current members about how overworked they feel they are and etc. Right? So um, you of course have to follow all the MMBA and make sure that you're following all the meet and confer requirements, etc. But you have people on your team or who are adjacent to your team, right, that are experts in that, that should be helping you navigate it. And so I want to, encourage you to think of them just as another stakeholder. And maybe you have to engage them slightly differently because there's these different legal constraints, but that doesn't mean that really your approach is that much different. And oftentimes they want the change just as badly as you do.
Especially if part of what you're doing, and we're always asking people to like get the voice of the customers of your process, of the staff in your process. And if part of what you're doing is like listening to what their members' concerns are and trying to redesign the process to meet those concerns, I mean, sometimes they can actually be quite champions for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was absolutely the case in the San Diego example. We engaged, I think, 4 different labor unions, and every single one of them was like, how can we support this? Right. So it was great.
Yeah. I think we might have time for one-ish
One
more
more
question
question.
if anybody's
Yeah.
got one. I really appreciate your all being here and taking some time.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can say what we're going to be following up with them on. Did we already say that? I can't remember.
Oh, I thought I said, but you say it again. Bears
Okay.
repeating.
Well, we're going to send you an email with a survey. We're also going to, I think, share some of the blog links that we have from our past Lean Leaders participants. What else are we sending them? I think that's it.
And a link if you want to schedule time to talk to us, you can do that.
Right, right. Yes. Which is also on our website if you ever want to go it that way.
All right. Well,
Great.
I think if there's nothing else, I think we should wrap up.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you, everybody, for joining. It was really great to have you with us. And we look forward to future conversations with you about unlocking this capacity.